We stand for the gospel reading. It's a very strange gospel reading today from the secret gospel of Mark. So I want you to put on your thinking caps. And they came into Bethany, and this woman was there whose brother had died. She knelt down in front of Jesus and said to him, "Son of David, have mercy on me." But the disciples rebuked her. Then Jesus got angry and went with her into the garden where the tomb was. Just then, a loud voice was heard from inside the tomb. Then Jesus went up and rolled the stone away from the entrance to the tomb. He went right in where the young man was, stuck out his hand, and dragged him by the hand and raised him up. The young man looked at Jesus and loved him and began to beg to be with him. Then they left the tomb and went into the young man's house. Incidentally, he was very rich. 6 days later, Jesus gave him an order, and when eventime had come, the young man went to him, dressed only in a linen cloth. He spent that night with him because Jesus taught him the mystery of God's kingdom. From that place, Jesus got up and returned to the other side of the Jordan. The sister of the young man, whom Jesus loved, was there, along with his mother and Salome. But Jesus refused to speak to them. Figure that out. Nobody does intrigue better. Not the CIA, not Mossad, not the KGB. Nobody does intrigue better than the churches. And in the churches, nobody does intrigue better than the scripture scholars. If you really want a good detective story and you want to hear about vitriol, try reading some scholarly scriptural work at some stage. And today's gospel that we just read is a typical example of it. So I want to try to unpack it for us this morning. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. I'm going to ask myself the question, are there 3 versions to the Gospel of Mark? Secondly, what is the real story about this rich young man? Thirdly, I want to look at baptism as the sacrament of dying. And then fourthly, I want to ask myself the question, what's in a name? So the first piece is, are there 3 versions of Mark's Gospel? And I want to give you kind of a backstory to this firstly. In ancient times, when long before the printing press, making copies of a manuscript was a long, tedious job. And occasionally, monasteries would loan a copy of a sacred text to another monastery, and that would have to be laboriously copied by hand. So sometimes they would just give it in order to study it, and they wanted it back. Sometimes they gave permission to copy it, and they wanted the original returned. But there's a great story in the Irish church, in the Irish Celtic church, in about 550 AD, of an Irish saint called Saint Columcille. And Columcille was the founder of the great monastery in Scotland, in Iona, a little island called Iona. But the reason he founded the monastery was he was banished from Ireland. And he was banished from Ireland for the following sin. He was a monk in a monastery in Ireland, and they borrowed a sacred text from another monastery in order to study it. But very secretly, Columcille laboriously made a copy of the original manuscript and never told anybody, and then gave back the original after 18, 19 months of work, gave it back to the monastery. But they discovered that he'd made a copy of it, an illegal copy. So they were really upset. So there was a big debate went on, and all the abbots came together of the monasteries of Ireland to decide on the case. And the ruling was, to every cow its calf, and to every book its copy. And he had to give the book back. In other words, if he didn't have permission to copy the book, the copy did not belong to him. He had to give the copy back, and he was banished from Ireland and spent the rest of his days in Iona, founded the monastery in Iona. So there's the back story, way back. So now, fast forward to more modern times. It is still the practice that monasteries will still loan books to each other, and sometimes it's to study the old text, and sometimes it's to copy the old text. In 1958, an American scholar, he was a professor of ancient history at Columbia University, went to a monastery in the West Bank in Israel, a monastery called Marsaba. And in the course of his study, he was reading a book, a 17th century manuscript on the life of a character called Ignatius of Antioch, who lived in the 3rd or 4th century. And at the very end of the book, he came across an area where there were 4 or 5 empty pages. But some monk, obviously, in the 1700s or the 1800s or the 1900s, wrote in a copy of another document. He didn't have enough room to finish it, so we have no idea what happened to the rest of it, whether he wrote it in a different book or whatever. But there is a part of a letter allegedly written by Clement of Alexandria, who was a church father in the 2nd century. And it was a letter addressed to a character called Theodore. And so this was copied into the empty pages in the back of a more recent book, but purporting to go way, 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 way back. So what's the story behind this? Allegedly, this letter was a response that that Clement of Alexandria was making to Theodore, to a question Theodore had. And the question Theodore had was that he'd come across a group of Gnostic Christians who were making the claim that there was a secret Gospel of Mark. Now, we knew that there was a Gospel of Mark which was for public dissemination, given to non-Christians just to acquaint them with the story of Jesus. And then there may have been a private version which is circulated for Christians themselves with deeper stories. But now Theodore is hearing there's a third version called the secret Gospel of Mark. And this Gnostic group is using this to make all kinds of extraordinary and really upsetting claims about Jesus and who Jesus was. And so Theodore is writing to Clement saying, is there such a gospel? And here's what these guys are saying. They're saying it exists, that they have access to it, and here's what it says. And Clement responds to him and says, yes, there is a secret Gospel of Mark. And it's meant for the elite, for the initiates, the people who really want to go deeper into the mysteries of Christ. But no, they are totally misinterpreting this inner wisdom because they're not ready for it. Now, in actual fact, I hope I'm not shocking anybody here, but the Gnostic group who had access to this secret Gospel of Mark were claiming that Jesus was using homosexual encounters as initiation rites. And so if you listen very carefully to this book this morning, you could, if you wanted to, create that mindset that, Jesus raises this guy from the dead, spends the day with him, brings him over to his house. The guy arrives with a linen cloth. They spend the night together, and then the family are upset with Jesus. So this is how the Gnostics were interpreting it. And Clement is saying that is not the meaning of this gospel. There is a secret gospel, and it's only meant for those who are so steeped in the mysteries of Christ that they can understand what this symbolic story is about. But they haven't understood it, and they're making all these kind of wild claims. So this is what was written in the back of this book, allegedly. Now, he took photographs of this, and he wrote a book. The scholar was called Martin Smith in 1958. He wrote a book which was published in 1973, and it created bedlam, absolute uproar. And so other scholars got in to examine the text, and finally another group got access to it in the year 2003, and they took colour prints of it. And so there are colour prints of it, but the claim was that it was a forgery, either a forgery from the 18th or 19th century, or that Martin Smith himself had forged this document. So they really, really went at it. Now, there were some studies done, and some of the scholars are claiming that if you compare linguistically the style of the letter, it doesn't compare favourably with other letters known to have been written by Clement of Alexandria. And they wanted to do particular kinds of tests. And one test is, to take the ink itself and to figure out how old is the ink. But at the time that the document was discovered in 1958, the only people with that kind of equipment was the police force in Jerusalem. And the monastery wouldn't give it to the police force in Jerusalem. So that test was never done. And then since then, the document has disappeared. So the original, obviously, nobody ever had access to, the 2nd century document, if it was 2nd century, and the 17th century copy of it is now missing as well. So there's no idea where it is, and these scholars are going at each other's throat. So that's the backstory to this gospel this morning. So are there 3 versions of Mark's gospel? Is there a public one that we've been reading? Is there a private one that the initiates got to read? And is there a secret one that the mystics understood and knew how to unpack these stories in a mystical fashion, not in a literalist fashion? So that's my first point. So when you get into this story then of the rich man, and try to reconstruct it, and I'm going to try to unpack it in my own fashion. And you don't have to be a scripture scholar to recognize that there's something very strange about this particular story. if you're off way at all with the Christian scriptures, it seems like this story is actually some kind of a mishmash of three totally different characters. It's very like the story of Lazarus that you get in John's Gospel in chapter 11, where Jesus is asked by a woman who lives in Bethany, the same village, a sister to the man who has died, to come and raise her brother, Lazarus. Looks very, very like that. It looks very like the statement in John's Gospel that John the Apostle is the beloved disciple of Jesus. That of all the disciples Jesus had, there was 12 in the inner circle, and then there was a group of 3, Peter, James, and John, who were particularly important, and then there was John, who was called the beloved disciple. So there's parts of that. And then there's a story in Mark's Gospel in chapter 10 of the rich young man who comes to Jesus. And I'll tell you that story, and then I'm going to create a version of my own. Just going to fill in a whole bunch of gaps. And I'm using my imagination, so this is not gospel. The story in Mark chapter 10 is the following. One day, a rich young man comes to Jesus and he says, "Good master, what must I do in order to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus looked at him and he loved him. He could see this is a really, really, really good man. And he said, "You've read the scriptures. Keep the commandments. Don't kill, don't steal." And the young man says, "I've kept all of these since I was a young boy. What else do I need to do?" And then Jesus said to him, "There's one thing else you need to do. You need to sell all your possessions and follow me." And we're told in the original version of Mark's Gospel, the young man went away sad because he had lots of riches and lots of responsibilities. So that's the end of the story as it appears in the other version of Mark. Now, this story we just heard may be a follow-on to this piece. So here's my reconstruction. I'm going to use a little bit of pseudo-psychology and a good bit of imagination, and I'm going to fill in a bunch of blanks for you. So the young man goes away, and he's really, really, really sad. Because in his soul, he wants to be dedicated totally to the spiritual journey. But his dad is dead, and he's got responsibility for the estate. And he doesn't have any brothers who will take charge of it. He only has sisters and a mother, and they're not allowed to take charge of any kind of economic enterprise. They're not allowed to do that. And so they're totally dependent upon this guy to look after and manage the family finances. And he's wasting away. He hates what he's doing. This is not the life he wanted. He really, really wanted to pursue the spiritual journey. And so slowly by slowly, he's not eating anymore. He slips into major depression. He's wasting away. And finally he just gives up and he dies. And the family are crazed out and they run to Jesus. They know that Jesus has the ability to do miracles. They say, please, this young man, you remember he came to you a few months ago? He's dead. Can you do something? And Jesus gets angry. You've heard this statement. He gets really, really angry. Why would he get angry? Because he could see what was coming. He realized, you guys killed him. You took away his dream. You took away his passion, what he wanted to do, and you forced him into the family business. You're the reason he's dead. So he was really pissed with them, for making this. So he marches up to the tomb, rolls away the stone, goes in, grabs the guy, and just hauls him. It's not like he says, in the other version, Lazarus, come forth, gentle. He grabs him by the hand, and he hauls him out and brings him out. And then we are told the young man saw Jesus. The young man has now had a near-death experience. He's been in the grave for I don't know how long, but we know from modern resuscitation techniques that people, about 13 million Americans at this stage, have had near-death experiences. And it is life transformative from people who come back because they realize, that what their life was, that very, very often they were not following their passion, they were not digging deeper into their spirituality, they were following the family business, or what society told them was important. This young man is a totally changed being. So now he loves Jesus in the sense that he's identified now what his passion is and what his mission is. And so he spends the whole day with Jesus. Tell me more, bring me deeper. And Jesus begins educating him in the mysteries. And then Jesus says, I want you now to meditate on these things for 6 days. And 6 is a sacred number. 6 is the number of days of creation. God creates the entire universe in 6 days. And so this man is going to recreate himself and the sense of self. And then at the end of it, there will be an initiation rite. And the young man will come almost naked with this linen garment. And I'll say something about that in the third point I make. So the story is then that he's now dedicated his life to this new phase. And now the sister and the mother want to talk to Jesus again, and he won't talk to them. If he did talk to them, what would he say to them? Yeah. He would have said, do you want to lose your brother to death, or do you want to lose your brother to discipleship? You make the choice. You killed him once already. You want to kill him again? He refused to dialogue with them because he was so upset with the fact, the young man didn't have to die the first time. if the family had allowed him to follow his passion. And so Jesus refused to dialogue with the mother or the sister. So that's my version of the real story behind the rich gentleman. Which brings me to the third point. Baptism as a sacrament of dying. So when you dream, very, very often, your sense of self gets portrayed as dreams around your hair or your clothes. So the persona is represented symbolically in dream work, very, very often by your hair or the clothes you're wearing. So if you find yourself in a dream where all of a sudden your hair is either a total mess, or you've been shaved bald, or you're naked in public, these are really, really embarrassing kinds of dreams. And if you were to go to a psychologist who's working with dreams, they would say to you, that's saying something about your persona. The persona is the face that the ego wears to the public. It's whom I want you to think I am. And now in the dream, I'm being told, you're a sham. The emperor has no clothes. So when we have dreams where there's something wrong with our hair or something wrong with our clothes and we're naked, very, very often it's an invitation to not hide behind a false sense of identity. And so if I were to identify the three things that we kind of identify with, it would be, symbolically, it would be our hair, our clothes, and our name. They are the three great things that give us our sense of identity. So it's very, very interesting that when people join monasteries or young girls go away to be nuns, that they change those three things. They'll shave off their hair. Paul did the same thing before Paul took a Nazarite vow and shaved off his head when he decided to be a full-time follower of Jesus and dedicate himself. So you do something with your hair. If you're a monk, you receive tonsure. If you want to be a nun, you shave off your hair. You take off all the clothes, your street clothes that you were identified with, your jeans or whatever, and now you're given particular kinds of habit to be a nun or a monk. And finally, you change your name. You're given a brand new name to identify a whole new phase and a whole new self-understanding. And that's what, in the second reading today, I don't know if you picked up on it, there's some really strange phrases that Mary Kate read for us. Very, very enigmatic statements. Something like, if you think that you have to die before you rise from the dead, you don't understand death or resurrection. If you think that at the time when you breathe your last sigh and you shuffle off this mortal coil, all of a sudden there's this radical transformation and now you resurrect to a whole different self-understanding. The writer, Philip, in this case, is saying it doesn't happen like that. Death is not that dramatic a shift. It's a change of consciousness and a change of dimensions, but you bring who you are to the other side initially. There'll be growth happen there, but initially you bring exactly who you are to the dying process, to the death process, and to the after-death process initially. Because you're still somehow clinging to a wrong sense of self. So you have to learn how to die while you're still alive. And you have to learn how to resurrect while you're still alive. You have to learn how to disidentify with the old sense of self and re-identify with a much deeper sense of self. And so Philip will make these extraordinary statements that he would say stuff like, when you're on earth, the person is more important than the clothes they're wearing. But when you go to heaven, the clothes you're wearing are more important than the person. And what does that mean? Because if you go to heaven with your sense of self that you are the physical being who just arrived in heaven, you think that's who you are, and then you put on a totally different understanding of the self, that you're a bite-sized piece of God, what you're putting on, the clothes, is much more important than the person who's wearing the clothes. Because the person who's wearing the clothes is simply the ego just arrived at the other side. And so down here, we think we're more important than the garments we wear. And it's true that the physical body is more important than any apparel that we put on. But on the other side, if our sense of self is an ego, then what we put on, the clothes we put on, a sense of being a soul, that is far more important than the person who's initially wearing it, until you grow into the realization. So letting go of identities is so important. As I said to you many times, we start off identifying with the ego at the age of about 8 months. The ego constellates at the age of 8 months as a result of the awful realization that I'm not living in an oceanic bliss of unity consciousness in this mother-child complex where there's only one of us and I'm in charge. I shout, milk arrives. I shout, I get cuddled. I'm cold, somebody loves me. I feel lonely, somebody hugs me. And about the age of 8 months, the child begins to realize, holy God, we're separate from each other, and she has all the power. She can go away, and I'm left like a caboose with the engine gone way down the tracks. And at this stage, the ego constellates, and we identify with the ego. And then we create all these defense mechanisms to protect ourselves against this awful realization. So now we start identifying with a whole bunch of stuff. We identify them with our physical body. And then we begin to identify with our emotions. We think we are our emotions. And then we think we are our thoughts. We think we are the things that are going through our head up here. Then we begin to identify with the jobs we do. Then we identify with relationships we're in. So all of these are misidentifications. So there's this great phrase in the Gospel of Luke that I've run by you several times. It's a statement where Christ says, you must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. Now the interesting thing is, although the New Testament is written in Greek, Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic. And the Aramaic word that's translated as Father, the Aramaic term is avun. Avun is much more accurately translated as birthing principle of the cosmos, that which gives life to all forms. So the fertile womb out of which all manifestation emerges. So that's really the word that's translated wrongly, as our Father. It's avun. It's birthing principle of the cosmos, that which gave life to all that is. And the word that's it's translated into English as compassion, the original Aramaic word is rachamim, and rachamim is the plural of the word for a womb. So here's Christ saying, you must be womb-like, just as the birthing principle of the universe itself is a womb. Now what is a womb? A womb is that which can, accept a seed, gestate it, and give birth to life again and again and again, not just once. And so what Christ is saying is, you must keep giving birth to your sense of self until you get let go finally of that you are just your body. Or you are your emotions, or you are your thoughts, or you're the job you do, or the roles you play, or the relationships you're in. You must keep giving birth again and again and again. You must be womb-like, like your birthing principle of the universe is womb-like, until finally, to use Meister Eckhart's phrase, you give birth to God. Meister Eckhart says, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. Because ultimately, there is only God. Every one of us, as I keep saying to you, is God in drag. There is only God. God is giving birth to all these articulations of ourself in order to experience. And so our core identity is that we are God as you, or as a plant, or as a banana slug, having an incarnational experience. And when you give birth to that realization, that's the ultimate. Then you've shed all of the other misidentifications and you've understood who you are. And the final point I want to make this then is what's in a name? Because of the three modes of self-identification, symbolically, hair, clothes, and a name, the name is the most important of all, it seems to me. So there's this great story that I love in the Hebrew Scriptures, I think it's chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, where God has made all of these helpers for Adam and Eve. He's created all these animals. And then he brings Adam and Eve into the garden and he says, name them. And we get this notion that Adam and Eve went around with a notepad, and said, we look at this guy with the long neck, what are we going to call him? Rabbit? No, rabbit, no, that won't work. Lizard? No, that doesn't do it. How about giraffe? Bingo. Giraffe. Let's call him giraffe. And we go around, they went around with their notebook and they started making up identity tags for all these animals in the garden. That has nothing got to do. It wasn't hanging identity tags in these things. When you know somebody's name, you're in connection with their essence, with their soul. And to name somebody is to meet them at a soul level, which is the meaning of this great Hindu phrase when you see Hindus say, namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. Then you know their name. And so they're being invited to look at all of the animals who are their helpmates and identify and connect with them, not to use them as resources to be exploited or controlled, but to realize that they're children of God. In the eyes of God, an elephant, a giraffe, a banana slug, and Jesus Christ have no distinctions. There's no more important than the other. Jesus Christ is no more important than a banana slug, as far as God is concerned. What is different is that the level of self-awareness of a Jesus Christ is very different from the level of self-awareness of a banana slug. But in God's eyes, they're all children of herself. And she loves all of them unconditionally. She doesn't parcel out her love in little bite-sized pieces. And so the name is this extraordinary ability to connect with the essence of. And so this job that they got was to see these as other manifestations of the divine and relate to them accordingly. So I then see, I'm totally convinced that every single one of us has a sacred name. And it is the song that your soul sang as it was winging its way into incarnation. And I believe, if you're really dying consciously, it's the soul you sing on your way back out, your own sacred, secret name. And that's the purpose of the wind. I remember being at home in Ireland June last year, and my brother Seamus is building a house for himself. And I was helping him out, and there was 4 or 5 other people working with him. And we had this pipe scaffolding all around the building, going up about 25, 30 feet. And it's just a circle of pipes just framed together. And often people on building sites will have radios and they're listening to music. And during the course of the day, I'm hearing this really, really plaintive, beautiful, beautiful music. It sounds a little bit like Enya, if any of you know Enya's kind of music, except there are no words to it. It's just musical, instrumental music. I think it's really, really beautiful. So at one stage, I turned to my nephew, young Seamus, and I say, who's playing that music? Have you got a radio hidden someplace? I can't see a radio. He says, no, I don't have a radio. And I look around, and nobody has a radio. And then I realize what's happening. It's the pipe scaffolding making the music. The wind blowing through the pipe scaffolding is making this extraordinary organ music. And I began to realize that the wind is the best musical conductor of all. That the noise that the wind makes is not that it's objecting to obstacles in its path, but it is enticing and seducing the soul out of everything it encounters. Whether it encounters reeds on the riverbank, or willow trees, or a piece of scaffolding pipe, or a piece of loose corrugated iron that becomes a symbol, or everything that the wind meets, it recognizes its soul and it calls forth its music from inside it. And that's the reason why so many languages use the word wind and breath and life and spirit are the same word. In Hebrew, the word is ruach. Ruach means life, breath, spirit. In Greek, it is pneuma. We get pneumatic tires, you put air in your tires. Pneuma means spirit or life. In Swahili, we use the word pepo in the very same way. It's life and spirit. In Sanskrit, they use the word prana. Prana is life, spirit, breath. And even in English, it sneaks in. We talk about inspiration and expiration. To inspire literally means to take spirit in, or to be alive, or to be creative, or to breathe in. And to expire means to die, literally to let go of spirit, or to breathe out. So this extraordinary connection between breath and life and spirit. And so the wind itself is the great namer, because the wind recognizes the name of everything it encounters, whether it's dead stuff like pipe scaffolding or a human being. And so the greatest identification of all is the identity of knowing your own sacred name. So here's a practice for you someday this week. Go out into the wilderness someplace, if you have access to a park someplace, on a windy day, and just hold your hands up and listen to the wind reveal to you your sacred name.